$1.75 billion. That is not a typo. $1,750 million raised from the biggest names in Hollywood and Silicon Valley. Disney invested, Sony invested, Warner Media invested, NBCUniversal invested, Alibaba invested. The most powerful entertainment companies on the planet all looked at this idea and said, yes, we believe in this, here is our money. 6 months later it was gone, every single dollar. And the product that consumed it all had fewer paying customers than a mid-sized YouTube channel. This is the story of Quibi, and it is one of the most expensive lessons in business history. Jeffrey Katzenberg was not a startup kid. He had run Disney. He had co-founded DreamWorks Animation, the studio behind Shrek and Kung Fu Panda. He had spent 4 decades at the absolute center of Hollywood power. When Jeffrey Katzenberg had an idea, the entertainment industry listened. Meg Whitman was not a startup kid either. She had taken eBay from a tiny startup to a global e-commerce giant. She had run Hewlett-Packard, one of the largest technology companies in the world. She had been worth billions. She had run for governor of California. When Meg Whitman joined a company, it sent a signal to every investor on the planet that this was serious. Together in 2018, they had an idea. People watch video on their phones during commutes, during lunch breaks, during those small pockets of dead time throughout the day. YouTube is free but low quality. Netflix is high quality but designed for your sofa, not your subway ride. What if there was something in between? Premium Hollywood quality content specifically designed for your phone. Each episode under 10 minutes. Perfectly framed for a vertical screen. The best stars in entertainment making the best possible short-form content money could buy. They called it Quibi, short for Quick Bites, and they raised $1.75 billion to build it. The investor list was a who's who of global media power. Disney, Sony, Viacom, NBCUniversal, Time Warner, MGM, Alibaba. T-Mobile signed a distribution partnership at CES in Las Vegas in January 2020. Katzenberg stood on stage and demonstrated their revolutionary turnstile technology, a feature that let users seamlessly flip their phone between portrait and landscape mode with both orientations perfectly and separately filmed. The audience was impressed. They hired Kevin Hart, Jennifer Lopez, Idris Elba, Sophie Turner, Reese Witherspoon, Liam Hemsworth, Tyra Banks, Chrissy Teigen, Chance the Rapper, Demi Lovato, Andy Samberg. The biggest names in entertainment were all on Quibi shows. They spent money like water because they had it. $1 billion of it was spent before a single user ever opened the app. April 6, 2020. Launch day. Quibi went live, and here is where the story gets dark. 2 weeks before Quibi launched, the world went into lockdown. COVID-19 had arrived, offices closed, schools closed, commutes stopped. The entire premise of Quibi, premium content for the moments in between your daily life, had evaporated overnight. There were no moments in between. There was no daily life. Everyone was sitting at home, on their sofa, in front of their television, watching Netflix. Katzenberg would later blame the pandemic entirely for Quibi's failure. He said there were really only 2 reasons Quibi did not succeed. 1 was the pandemic. 2 was the pandemic. But here is what the data actually shows. Because even accounting for the pandemic, there were deeper problems. Problems that existed long before March 2020. Problem 1. You could not share anything. In 2020, content did not spread through advertising, it spread through sharing. A clip goes viral on Twitter. Someone screenshots a moment and posts it on Instagram. A friend sends you a link. Quibi made sharing technically impossible. Their technology locked the content inside the app. You could not take a screenshot. You could not share a clip. You could not send your friend a moment that made you laugh. In an era where virality was everything, Quibi built a product that could not go viral by design. Problem 2, they did not understand their audience. Katzenberg and Whitman were legends of old Hollywood and old Silicon Valley. They understood the generation that watched premium cable. They did not understand the generation that watched TikTok. The people they were targeting, young phone-first viewers, were not looking for premium episodic content in 10-minute chunks. They were looking for authentic, raw, fast content that felt real. They already had YouTube. They already had TikTok. They already had Instagram Reels. Quibi offered them a polished, expensive version of something they already had for free. Problem 3. They launched on mobile only. If you wanted to watch Quibi, you had to watch it on your phone. You could not cast it to your TV. You could not watch it on your laptop. You could not share your screen. For a paid subscription service in 2020, this was extraordinary. Even Netflix, which had decades of experience, was available on every device ever invented. Quibi required you to stare at a phone screen to watch content you were paying for. They eventually added Apple TV and Chromecast support. In October 2020, 19 days before they announced they were shutting down. The subscriber numbers told the story in devastating clarity. Quibi had projected 7.4 million paid subscribers in its first year, a reasonable target given the investment and the talent involved. At the time of shutdown, Quibi had approximately 500,000 paying subscribers, not 7 million, not 5 million, not 2 million, 500,000. On October 21, 2020, Jeffrey Katzenberg and Meg Whitman published an open letter to their employees and investors. It read, and these are the actual words they used, "Our failure was not for lack of trying. We have considered and exhausted every option available to us." They returned approximately $350 million to investors. The remaining $1.4 billion was gone. The content library, shows that had cost hundreds of millions of dollars to produce, was sold to Roku for a figure reported to be well under $100 million. Roku relaunched the shows as free ad-supported content. Several performed reasonably well in that format, which is its own small, devastating lesson. The content was not the problem. The product was the problem. The business model was the problem. The timing was the problem. The assumptions were the problem. $1.75 billion. Two of the most experienced executives in the history of entertainment and technology. The backing of every major studio and streaming company on the planet. The biggest stars in Hollywood. Revolutionary proprietary technology. A marketing campaign that reached millions of people. And it lasted 6 months. So what is the lesson? Because there is always a lesson. Jeffrey Katzenberg was not stupid. Meg Whitman was not inexperienced. The investors were not naive. Collectively, these people had built some of the most successful companies in history. The lesson is this: money does not validate an idea. Experience does not validate an idea. The names attached to an idea do not validate it. The only thing that validates a business idea is whether a real person with real choices voluntarily chooses your product over everything else available to them. Nobody chose Quibi. Not because they could not afford it. Not because they had not heard of it. But because when they looked at it and looked at everything else on their phone, they made a different choice. $1.75 billion could not change that choice. Nothing could. That is the dark side of business. And there are hundreds more stories exactly like this one. Subscribe to GlowGyst, because the most expensive mistakes in history are the ones worth understanding.